Hi everybody. Today I'm going to talk about language awareness in 10 questions. Actually, the information I'm going to share is based on an article by some global researchers. You can see their names on the slide. And let's start with awareness in general. Do you remember this riddle? You are a passenger on a bus. The bus starts out empty. At the first stop, 4 people get on. At the second stop, 8 people get on. 3 get off. At the third stop, 2 people get off. 4 get on. And finally, they ask you what color the bus driver's eyes are. And you're simply surprised and say, "What bus driver? I didn't pay attention to him and his eyes. I was calculating the numbers of passengers getting on and off." Because you were not aware of the eye color of the bus driver. Awareness is being conscious of the things around us, noticing them. What about language awareness? Is it the same thing? Well, kind of. It is being aware of the language by paying motivated attention to it, how it is used. Also, in our schools, as a pedagogic approach, it aims to help learners to gain such insights about the language they are learning. Many years my students complained to me about the fact that they were never able to learn English, although they were exposed to it at primary school, secondary school, high school, and in the prep school I was teaching. They were still surprised at the fact that they were not able to understand it at all after all those years. And I was always thinking, and saying that maybe they were not aware of the fact that they were learning the language. You shouldn't always blame the education system or the teachers or the students, but also the factor of awareness. Okay, continue with some more definition. Language awareness is discovery based, and it leads students, to develop a growing insight into the way language works. They ask questions about the language. They ask why we use a certain thing in a certain sentence, why we use present perfect with for and since. They question it. And they just don't do it at school environment, but also outside the school, because they perceive language not as a course, but as a tool of communication that will help them outside the school as well. Language awareness is dynamic and intuitive, gradually developed internally by the learner. So learner is at the center of this approach. Learner is independent and autonomous and making attempts to learn on his or her own. And it helps to develop a healthy spirit of inquiry. There is a positive questioning about the language. And critical language awareness. Oh, what's that? Well, as we know, we don't work in classrooms that are made up of single groups. Our classrooms are composed of students from several cultures, identities, religions. The language itself also, English, but what kind of English are we talking about? American English, Canadian English, religious English, what English? So there are many sociocultural and political factors that have shaped the language as well. So while becoming aware of the language, we couldn't neglect those factors as well. So this is what critical language awareness deals with. So how should we view language awareness? We should see it as an approach rather than a movement, although it is explicit in the form of teaching. It involves metalinguistic rules and terminology. As an approach, it's a reaction against top-down transmission of language knowledge. Here, awareness is developed by the learner. It's internal, gradual realization of the realities of language use, and it's driven by the positively curious learner paying conscious attention to instances of language in an attempt to discover and articulate patterns of language use. And hereby I have to emphasize that language awareness is not a method, but rather an approach. Alright, let's continue. What are the main principles that frame this approach? As you know, if a student is willing to learn, if a student effectively engages himself or herself into something, on a purpose with motivation, he will certainly, most likely, will achieve. Moreover, if a student is aware of the language, he will notice the gap between his knowledge and the proficient user's knowledge, and he will make attempts to cover this gap by further learning and scratching of the language. And hereby our objectives are to help students notice this gap and provide them with skills such as connecting, generalizing and hypothesizing, and help them to become more independent with positive attitudes towards the language. So what we mean is that we are helping students to gain strategies of language learning and use. We are kind of channeling them into the path of discovering language. We are not passive as teachers, but most of the job is on the students, because there they become aware of how much they know, how they learn better, what kind of motivation they need, what kind of language they are dealing with, what are the factors that contributed to their learning. All these things are mostly onto the student. So how is the procedure? It is experiential. Students kind of go through an experiential process in which, for example, they come contact with a text and make some mental representations of the text, make some responses towards it, compare it with other texts and with their peers. They all experience it on their own, and meanwhile they have an interactive collaboration with learners and learners, with learners and teachers, with learners and the proficient users of the language. Well, critical question. What are the relationships between language awareness and existing theories of language? Where is it located among these learning theories, teaching theories? Well, there is an atomistic approach, as you know, in which each skill is separately viewed, like reading, okay, vocabulary learning, grammar learning. But in this approach, language awareness approach, everything is learned in a holistic way, all together. And this means that language is not simply a language. It is a tool for something. What is it? Social communication, a cultural communication. It's a medium, and it can only be done by weaving all the elements of language in a holistic way. You are not simply learning vocabulary to know words, you are learning vocabulary to use them in a conversation. So, first of all, language awareness has a social-cultural aspect. On the other hand, it has also a cognitive aspect, because these things are happening in the mind of students. Students are exposed to some kind of information. They pay attention to it. You remember how important attention is important in SLA. And after this attention and explicit learning, they become ready to learn. And hereby, although we said explicit learning is more important in language awareness, there is also implicit learning happening as well. First in the discovery form, then a student reinforces it by explicit learning, and then become totally ready to learn, attain knowledge. Okay, what about deductive versus inductive methods? Where is language awareness at this point? It is of course inductive, like task-based learning and process-based learning, but it's not totally inductive, because unlike the other inductive methods, in language awareness approach there is no predetermined language syllables. It can change shape, and the assessment is also very crucial for this dynamic approach. We should be well aware of the target product we expect, what the format of it is, and the timing of the assessment as well. Let's continue with the question, what are the relationships between language awareness and existing models of teacher education? As you know, pre-service teachers, if they are non-native for instance, first start learning grammar, vocabulary, I mean the knowledge of the language. If they are native speakers, it is is also not enough. They have to learn, about the development of this knowledge, how to teach and why to teach. They should get CELTA and etc. Okay, but no matter how much training uh, pre-service teachers have, they will always have difficulty in converting this theoretical knowledge into practical, experiences. And in this context, trainee teachers need to be able to analyze language, to apply different strategies for thinking about language in order to be able to plan lessons, to predict learners. So if you want to, prepare a lesson for tomorrow, for example, first you should have to think about the right strategies, right? Because not every lesson plan is valid for every class. It may not work in some of your classes. You will have maybe unexpected incidents, so you have to be selective in your and critical in your planning. Well, we could say that teacher education calls for independent and critical thinking in this context. So you will now ask maybe, okay, where is language awareness in teacher education? There is no separate thing as language awareness in teacher education because it's closer to reflective practice. Actually it exists as the form of reflective practice, which means a process which allows trainees to use their own experience of language and language learning as a starting point for questioning and reflecting, thereby establishing a strong basis for learning selectively about language and applying this learning in planning for a classroom action. You see the process? You already know something, you take it as a starting point, but you question it, then you reflect on it, then you select from it, you apply it. It's very similar to how learners, students, perceive language awareness. It's similar. And then we have a very different question here. What is the role of affect in a language awareness approach? Well, we could say that engagement in a language, in learning a second language, creates some emotions, emotional reactions in classrooms. And they may have questions and doubts about the target culture, language. They may question certain emotional factors related to language. They may have biases. And most of the time we don't discuss such things in the classroom, right? We don't question, for example, why girls achieve more success than boys in foreign language learning. However, if we are sensitive to affect emotions in classrooms, it will help us to unblock failing learners by encouraging them to respond effectively as well as cognitively to language inputs of various kinds. So you could say that affective factors are as important as the cognitive factors and they shouldn't be neglected. And then, what are the main justifications for using a language awareness approach? Now, why do we have to use it in our classrooms? I think we have got to this point by, talking about the things we have mentioned before. It is very teacher friendly. It is holistic, and here you are not doing the whole job in the classroom. On the contrary, your students are now autonomous learners. They are independent, so it's very teacher friendly and it's facilitating communication, communicative approaches. It is holistic, and this way it balances the form-focused atomistic approaches. Well, what can we achieve through language awareness work? What happens after we do this in our classrooms particularly? Well, at classrooms, you will have a chance to discuss about the language. Let's assume that you are teaching English to beginners. They have no idea of the target language, right? You will initially use the mother tongue, but you can turn this into a language awareness activity. You may discuss the differences between their mother tongue and the target language. You can talk about the analogies, similarities. They can even think about their own language and become aware of how it is different from the target language. This way, language classes become more educational. Learners develop the capacity to think critically about language and about the target culture. They will get beneath the surface of a language. in ways which knowledge-based approaches alone can never achieve. This is important, getting beneath the surface of a language. Well, what is the future? The future of language awareness. So many times I have heard my students complaining about the course books which don't appeal to them, their culture. They find them totally different from their context and they don't want to be engaged with them. So, by gaining language awareness, especially curriculum developers and teachers may create more appealing learning context for students. And here are some classrooms which the writers of the article dream of about the future of language awareness. They hope for classes in which some lessons are experiential, in which some of the classes are experiential and analytical at the same time. Other lessons are analytical, but in all these classes, the learners are asked to think for themselves and encouraged to become more aware and more critical, questioning, challenging the traditional norms, policies, attitudes, conventions about language. And this is the only way they think that goes to the, you know, that goes to better classrooms in which students are aware of what they are learning. And this way, learning happens, really happens. Well, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening to me. So hopefully I made my points clear. See you in other presentations. Goodbye.